This is my intro. There are many others like it, but this one is mine.
Hello, sports fans, and welcome to my humble apartment, where I definitely don't have a moonshine still in my bathroom. I'm kidding. It's your man Dan, and I'm back with a historical series. Today we're tackling on a very popular and very beloved Pan-Africanist Marxist, Thomas Sankara. If you're like me, you learned about Thomas Sankara well when you were an adult, if you learned about him at all. Thomas Sankara was the leader of a country called Burkina Faso. In local dialect, it means land of upright people or upright men. I don't know the local dialect so well, so don't crucify me for that. Anyway, Sankara was born in 1949 in what was then called Upper Volta, a former French colony in very big air quotes, in what is known as the Sahel, which is basically a sub-Saharan region which also falls under the greater sphere of French influence. That area of the world had been composed of French colonies. Today it's known as Francophone Africa. And after the formal decolonization of France, there was still unofficial colonization going on through the Franc Afrique, French financial control, and outright French assassination. But back to Thomas Sankara. He was born in 1949 in what was then Upper Volta. He attended the military when his parents wanted him to become a Roman Catholic priest. Good on him. Much better career path, much more honorable. And eventually he would become an officer in the army of Upper Volta. And he would start to become exposed to Marxist ideas in officer school. Because the officer school at this time was taught by civilian teachers, and a number of them took on their best and brightest students off to the side to talk about liberation, Pan-Africanism, nationalism, African liberation, and Marxism. Later on in his life, Sankara would do some more military training in France, where he would be further exposed to communist ideas from the French Communist Party. In 1972, Sankara took part in parachute training in Madagascar, where at the time there was a popular revolt of students and farmers against the ruling elite, which had been appointed by France. And to say the least, this would plant ideas in his head. And eventually, Sankara would become the leader of Burkina Faso in, I believe it was 1983. He became the leader of the country through a military coup, much like the Egyptian socialist Gamal Abdel Nasser. And he would rule until 1987, when he was assassinated by a coup with the covert backing of the French, because as they do. Anyways, what was his rule like? Well, in the first year of his reign, he and his government planted 10 million trees in order to fight desertification. There was a major push for literacy, a major push for women's rights. Actually, it runs a lot like most socialist governments. There's a major push for women's rights, literacy, and environmentalism. More or less the opposite of what you see happening in the United States or typical capitalist countries. I mean, you sure as hell don't hear about literacy and women's rights in Saudi Arabia, although they're America's best friend outside of Israel. But anyways, back to Sankara. He was a dedicated Marxist. He was also a member of the non-aligned movement, which were countries that didn't want to be specifically under the sphere of influence of the then Soviet Union or the United States. So he was tight with people like Fidel Castro and Maurice Bishop of Grenada. And this is just a little bit of tinfoil hat time here, but I do believe that part of the reason that he was assassinated was because he pulled Burkina Faso out of the IMF and the World Bank, and he correctly identified the major threat to African independence as lending and debt. Because at the time that he was alive, formal African colonialism was basically dead and gone since the 1960s, but imperialism is like a monster from Resident Evil. Just when you think that the boss is done, they mutate into their next, more dangerous form. So direct troops and direct control were replaced by indirect control, capital controls, and finance. For example, in the former Sahel countries of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, those countries used to be using the French franc as their currency, and their economic policy was set by French banks. So it's an informal, under-the-table colonialism, with the intent of robbing the country blind without having to put soldiers in danger. In fact, there's actually quite a famous speech by his of the Pan-African Congress about why debt is the enemy. I'll be sharing that in the link. And I think that is very, very relevant and very excellent, because he really understood what the enemy of Africa was. And part of the reason that I wanted to talk about Sankara was I talked about Kwame Ture, who was another Pan-Africanist. And what you see among these real African liberation leaders is, if not an outright embracing of Marxism, this very far left view that deals with nationalism and liberation. It's like when I was a kid, we wondered why Africa was poor, and of course we were fed lies, and movies were about Africa were still pretty racist. They were just more genteel racist than what they had in the days of Laurel and Hardy. And I believe there is a shift now. Currently in the news, the Ivory Coast has kicked out all French troops. The Sahel countries have not only kicked out French troops, but they are nationalizing industry and doing land reforms. It's really hard to find English language sources about this, so I'll post one article in the description. But I would look into Sankara. The current Sahel leaders cite him directly as their inspiration. They dress like him. They use rhetoric like him. And also they have talked about moving away from the IMF and International Monetary Fund. So with that very short history lesson aside, I hope you learned something. He was a great man. That was why the French killed him. And more than that, he was the leader of a popular people's movement. So thank you for coming today. I will see you next time. Have a great one. Please remember to like and subscribe.
This is my outro. There are many others like it, but this one is mine.